Thank you, thank you. The title of our panel is The Right to Vote, which I believe we will be able to tackle fully in the next 25 minutes. But really, we are going to discuss one of the most significant changes to both voting rights and criminal justice law in the last couple decades in America, and that's Florida's Amendment 4. Now, Neil and Tanisha, you were heavily involved in the passage and in the conceptualization of this ballot initiative. Can you tell us more about your getting involved and what the amendment did?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, one, thank you for having us. We're grateful for the opportunity to talk about this important issue with everybody. And I guess my involvement ultimately started when I got my felony conviction 13 years ago and moved to Florida and realized that we were living in a state that was one of 4 states at the time that permanently barred people for the rest of their life for voting. And by the time I got there, we realized what a huge problem it was that we were looking at 1.5 million people whose voices were silent. That's like saying to the state of New Hampshire or West Virginia, like nobody here can vote. It was a very big problem, and not a whole lot was being done about it. I think you had some good, well-intentioned folks who wanted to try and do something, but ultimately it came down to people who were dealing with the pain of this policy that was broken, led by Desmond Meade, who's the leader of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He headed up the campaign arm, and ultimately we built a campaign around people. And it was as basic as that. It was about people and people's lives. We did not want ultimately to make this a overtly partisan issue. We wanted to focus on real people's lives and making progress, because, for example, there were 3 carve-outs in the Amendment 4, right? One, it said that if you were found guilty of murder, you did not qualify. If you were felony sexual offenses, did not qualify, and also said that you had to complete all terms of your sentence, right? So for somebody like us, like for me, I'll say, I believe that everybody can be restored. I believe that if you committed murder, you can be restored. That's my belief. But that isn't what we did in Amendment 4. We took a lot of time to try and make a strategic step to move the ball forward. And I think that when we stop for a second and declutter and really think about the fact that there are 1.4 million people in our country last year who were unable to vote for the rest of their life, they can now vote. And that's a huge step forward.
And my story is a little similar to Neil's. I got in trouble back in 2009. I'm a single mother, and I moved to Florida in 2017 with my voting right because my crime happened in Pennsylvania, where they actually restore your voting right. And when I got down here, I actually tried to get a job, and I couldn't get the job because I actually had a second-class felony. And that's when I actually realized how disenfranchised, people like myself are. And I wanted to get involved with FRC, and I got involved, and I've just moved up the ladder. I do this fight for my children. I do this fight for my brother who's incarcerated right now. So I really do this fight with a passion, and just to make sure that my kids don't have to go through this 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Now, Senator, you were an architect for SB 7066, correct? And that piece of legislation is something that's been proven to be pretty controversial in the context of this conversation. Can you tell us about it?
So I'm in an interesting place because I was both an early supporter of Amendment 4 because I saw how broken the former system was. And then I was asked to work on the legislation that helped implement and address those 3 questions. What is murder? What is a felony sexual offense? These are undefined terms, right? So we needed to add some definition to what those meant. And then, what does the words all terms of sentence mean? What does the word all mean? What does the word terms mean? And what is a sentence? And so what we looked at and determined was that it all meant everything. Terms meant kind of everything on the piece of paper. All the obligations were the terms. And a sentence was essentially everything within the 4 corners of the sentencing documents. And I think that has led to some other discussions, right? What does this mean for fines? What does this mean for fees? What does this mean for court costs? Are court costs part of a sentence? Are fines part of a sentence? Clearly, your term of incarceration is part of a sentence. But what else is part of a sentence? I think the exciting thing is the conversations that are being generated right now about, wait a second, we have a lot of statutory kind of costs into the into fines and fees that really nobody had looked at in decades. You know, $2 goes here, $5 goes there, $20 goes here. You know, some of it goes to the victim's trust fund, but those things can't be waived. So part of what we work to do is put together, obviously, the definitions for what is murder, what is a sexual offense, and what are all terms of sentence. But then we went, I think, one step beyond that, which was we tried to provide some mechanism for individuals to go back to court and get their fines and fees reduced. If they had restitution owed, they could go to their victim and get the victim to waive the restitution. We know less than 10% of people owe restitution in the system, but how do we get that waived for them? And so we tried to go a little bit above and beyond that. Now there's still some controversy around fines, fees, and costs being part of a sentence. That question is both before the federal court and before the state Supreme Court right now as an opinion. So those issues will be resolved, and I have no doubt, based on that resolution, that the legislature will come back if we need to and address that.
Within the context of this new law that everybody's put forward and that's now part of the daily lives of people in the state, it essentially would create a system by which some people will have to pay money to vote, though, correct? Is that what?
Well, they have to complete all the terms of their sentence, and that's the place that the constitutional amendment has put us.
How do you feel about the argument that constitutes maybe a poll tax?
So I fundamentally reject that argument, and I do that because a poll tax was a horrible disgrace upon this nation. But the architects of this legislation clearly had multiple choices of language they could have used. They could have said, no, it's just the term of confinement. But they polled that, and they realized that probably didn't pass. They could have chosen a variety of different ways that this language could have landed on the ballot. But they chose this language, and it says all terms of sentence. And as somebody who has raised my hand and sworn to support and defend this Constitution, I now am bound by the words on the page. And so I have to believe that means all, and all does not mean some.
Now, I want to offer Neil and Tanisha a chance to answer this. What does the phrase all terms of a sentence mean to you?
Well, I would look back on, the formulation of the amendment, right? And what it did is that we have aspirational goals and we have beliefs, right? I have spent much of my life working on democracy issues and advancing the cause of democracy. And to be a part of Amendment 4 has been an honor of a lifetime. But we also knew that was aspirational with the conversations that we would have. What we did was actually we went around the state and we talked to the public. We literally did focus groups. We literally talked to people and figured out what is the public willing to accept and move forward with us in this area. And what the public was talking about were these three items. One, they said they did not have an appetite for people convicted of murder. They did not have an appetite for people with sex offenses, and there was a belief that a sentence needed to be completed. And so for us, we campaigned on the belief that restitution was a part of the completion of sentence, for instance. I broke the covenant with my community, right? And I believe in restoration. Restoration changes lives, and I believe everybody can be restored. But there is a very real process of making sure that all sides of that conversation are whole so that we can move forward together, create safer communities and better, communities together. And so that we believed that, and we publicly supported Senator Brandis's bill at the very end of the session that included a requirement for restitution. And obviously the words in the Constitution involving probation. I know when I went through probation, to finish probation, there is a financial obligation associated with that. So I think one of the challenges is that people try to figure out what every voter thought, and we're not really going to be able to figure out what every voter thought. We're on the ground right now operating under this law and registering people, and we fought. So there's not a bigger evangelist for democracy than somebody who lost the right to vote and got it back. So we're in the streets, we're talking to folks in our communities, and we're getting people registered under this law, and we're helping them overcome what hurdles are associated with some financial obligations, but we do so knowing that Amendment 4 broke down the wall of the lifetime ban that was put there 150 years ago under Jim Crow, and that is no longer a reality in Florida. So we're ready to keep moving forward. We want to make voting and registering people to vote fun again. So our view is where other people see obstacles, we see opportunities.
Tanisha, the panel before us was on women in the criminal punishment system, on things like reentry. I'm curious as to how, if you've met anybody, if in your experience, you've talked about the ways in which, say, the restoration of voting rights maybe dovetails with some of the other challenges or reductions of challenges to women, specifically within who have been incarcerated, who are returning citizens.
I absolutely come across and have met people that are actually working in criminal justice reform, and we have started talks around women's right in voting. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there's not a big difference from men and women when it comes to the restoration of voting rights, because we're in this democracy where it's equality. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we have a big difference, but we're all fighting for the same equal rights.
I'll clarify the question from my reporting on voting rights. We understand that oftentimes when you have one of the bigger obstacles is women find it harder to get off jobs, to juggle between childcare and all these other issues with voting. We know there's a couple more economic, job, just facts of life struggles, especially for low-income mothers, that may be compounded by having a felony charge. Is that something that people have talked about at all?
I can speak from my personal experience. Definitely, when I came home from prison, it took me about 6 months to actually find a job. I got my voting rights back, so that wasn't really an issue for me until I actually moved to Florida. Talking to women in Florida, finding jobs is definitely hard to do, and we encourage entrepreneurship, as so myself have started my own business, so that way I can actually give back to my returning citizens community and make sure that we don't have these obstacles in place.
Now, this is I think the entire audience, this time in America is interesting when it comes to these kind of reforms. There seems to be both a bipartisan opportunity. You've got lots of people on both sides of the political aisle who are discussing ways to just make the criminal punishment system less onerous on people. But also, there seem to be some people who, for political purposes, may not quite enjoy the idea of having more people voting, or maybe thinking about that as political engineering. Senator, I want to ask about, does that tension ever show up in your line of work and then the people that are involved in your caucus?
No, if this language had been written to say, and had it passed, it said, after the term of incarceration, I have no doubt that the legislature would have implemented it so that the term of incarceration was the finality. It doesn't say that. It says all terms of sentence. And so the legislature is then put in a place where it has to deal with this all terms of sentence definition. But I know that that's the underlying current, is we'd like to think that there's just this evil intent. I can tell you there is no stronger person for criminal justice reform in the state of Florida than our team and what the Florida Senate's doing right now. We see the utter brokenness of a prison system and a criminal justice system where it stacks the deck against everybody in the system. We see people carrying around felonies like it's Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter for the rest of their lives. And we see the injustice that creates. And I hope that we can continue to work on what the definition of fines and fees really means. I think that that's going to be, again, resolved by our courts shortly. But I think it's up to the legislature to look internally and say, guys, look, we have fines and fees out there that make no sense, that are completely disconnected from what the penalty truly should be. For example, if you steal a fish in Florida from an aquacultural facility, it carries a $10,000 fine, right? That makes no sense. But that's what the fine is. I mean, if you go through the Florida code, it's replete with those types of fines, fees, and other costs. But I think what this conversation does is it forces us to have a very detailed, thoughtful explanation for every fine and fee. But because before, the standard was, are you a felon? Are you not a felon? That was how you got to vote. Now it's, we've got to come back and begin to address the harder questions of, are these fines rational? Are they reasonable? Because if they don't, the penalty is individuals can't vote.
What you're speaking to, I believe, is this larger realization now among lots of people tuned into this issue, which is most of mass incarceration operates out of state and local law. Mm-hmm. And I know you've worked on introducing things like the Florida First Step Act. Do you think there's an appetite among states for, say, doing something like that, say, porting the First Step Act into state actionable items?
I think so. And I think it's growing. And I think that's the encouraging thing for me, is that there is a bipartisan group, at least in Florida, there's a bipartisan group that's working to change the overall system. And it starts with diversion. You have to revise the criminal punishment code. We have to fix our prison system. And we have to work on reentry. And there is more work than I could do in 50 legislative sessions. But it took us a generation or two to get to here. I mean, Florida has been a radically changed state over the last few years as it becomes to this conversation on criminal justice reform. It started, I would say, back in 2014, 2015. But I can tell you right now, our prison system is overstuffed with inmates. That we have prisons where I have a 40% vacancy rate of guards because I can't hire guards for $33,000 a year. And that conversation is leading to all the other conversations going on. And people come to it for different reasons, right? The far left may think it's a social justice issue. The libertarians may see it as a liberty issue. The conservatives may see it as a fiscal issue. I don't care how you get there. I just want you there, and I want you working with us, because I think there are best practices throughout the country that we can follow and we can implement, and we can make both Florida safer and improve the lives of people that are in the system.
Now, Tanisha, we talked backstage about just how many miles you put on the car and the rental cars, canvassing the state, going and meeting all these, a whole bunch of returning citizens. Can you tell us, now that the contours of Amendment 4 and rights restoration in Florida are established, what are the things now that those folks are looking for or need in order to be able to go vote?
Well, the right to vote has been restored, so it's not necessarily that they need anything, because they were given their right back to vote when Amendment 4 passed. So basically what I'm doing is going around the state and building up the momentum to get all of the returning citizens that have their rights restored to vote, encourage them to actually use their voting power. So we're just trying to make our communities more safer.
You find that things like local DA's races are really important in getting people out there?
Well, we're nonpartisan, so we're not really focused on the races, but in our meetings, we're definitely encouraging or making sure that they know how to advocate for themselves. So we're not necessarily focused on any of the political races, but just making sure that everybody is educated about the political system.
Now, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience, so get those ready in your back pockets. Neil, my last question is to you, and it's you've all put together this, again, maybe the most substantive change in American voting laws in quite some time. What's next?
Great question. And I would say that I think one of the things that we've seen as the implementation of Amendment 4 has begun is this cultural shift on the right, the left, and just in the language that we use. I love hearing returning citizen instead of felon. And also this concept that, the theme of the campaign was really 7 or 8 words depending on your use of an apostrophe, right? It's like, when a debt's paid, it's paid. And we saw, and we continue to see this kind of challenge over defining when a sentence is complete. And it might be that People didn't want sentences to be complete, and so there's this institutional challenge to ultimately landing in the right spot. But what we see is individuals, human beings, embracing this concept that when a debt's paid, it's paid, and we believe that's powerful. We believe that when you begin to talk about economic opportunities, the opportunity to live in a house, after having a felony conviction, access to opportunities and education, that if we truly believe when a debt's paid, it's paid, we can actually begin to mobilize and allow people to live up to their God-given potential, and in the process, create safer communities and a stronger state in Florida, and hopefully be an example to the rest of the nation. We think it's really cool to have been a part of a process in which a bunch of folks that the rest of the community looks at as outcasts was able to put a network together of people who aligned along the lines of humanity and love, not along the lines of hatred and partisan division, but out of the pain of real life, came together and decided to say, look, we're the only ones who can make the difference, and began this movement. And that network still lives in the state of Florida. When people voted in November, they didn't vote, when it came to Amendment 4, they didn't vote for a politician, they didn't vote for a partisan ideology or an agenda. They voted for a friend, a family member, a loved one that they knew. And we think those seeds are planted firmly in the soil in Florida, and we're really optimistic about what it means for the future of criminal justice reform, and ultimately just for the lives of people in the state.
Thank you. And let's open up the questions.
All right, that's cool. I got to stand up, right? All right. Hey, my name is Hampton Graham, of course. Support y'all doing y'all movement, allowing people with felonies to vote, because that is, everybody needs to vote regardless of what you done, because everybody does stuff bad. In the day, you got to grow and be prospering in life. So, I support y'all. I appreciate it. Which every state can do that, be open-minded about the same thing, because that's just backwards. Because you're not going to hear the people, hey, he wants to be in office. He has a felony. He can't vote. So how can he show his growth in his education, of his knowledge, his mind, and bring that wisdom to the people? Then we can all support one another, but it's backwards, right? Because I got charges too, so I'm discriminated. I can't walk and say, hey, can I get a job at corporate? No, you got charges. Does my corporate leader do bad stuff? Yes, he does. Does he have charges? I don't think so. But we always like to desensitize that, And I wanted to shed light to, did you guys take this out of the state, out of Florida state, and, do campaign movements? I don't know your position in the politics right now, because I forgot, I'll be honest with you, but can you use your authority to pull the campaign, somehow pull the people that in office, because you guys all talk off work out duties and stuff, but open their mind if they even listen and considering, because the right to vote brings more than just voting. You got to hear the people. People not going to listen to you because you're in office. People listen to people who's in the room right now, who's on the streets, because that brings economic growth, right? You want finances and credits to move, you got to let the people enjoy themselves, be happy. Because if I went to jail, I did go to jail, it sucks in there, brother. They're negative. All I can do is military, or, I want to have that authority role or authority mind, but you ain't going to live happily. You're going to be complacent,
I want to repackage. So you're asking.
Yeah, do they bring this campaign out the state of Florida and bring it to other states which is closed-minded, because that's backwards? And do you guys offer everything else outside of voting? Education when they get out, because they can't even socialize correctly when they get out. They're feeling uncomfortable. They feel attacked, but they don't know how to be themselves anymore. They're lost. I can be myself. I got 2 children. I still struggle to get a job,
So let's start with whether we can get it out of Florida. Move it out.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of best practices that we're going to identify here and that we can take throughout the states. I think Florida's learning a lot from Texas. Texas was a leader in criminal justice reform. I think as it relates to some of the other states, we're learning a lot, and we need to begin to have the courage to implement it. But I think as it relates to voting, I'm encouraged by where we are, where we're going, and I think once we have a little bit more clarity in a few months, when the court cases are all resolved, we'll be able to continue to work on fines, fees, and costs as to get those down and to true those up.
All right, one more question.
Hi, thanks to everybody for their work. With an eye on outcomes, I'm just wondering what proportion of returning citizens are not going to be enfranchised because they still owe fines, fees, or restitution?
So the the place we go to and have for years is the Sentencing Project. And they're obviously, you know, somebody who works there might be in the room. They're just kind of top of the line in terms of data management and studying stuff. So to the best of our ability, if you look at the 1.4 million people, right, who no longer face a lifetime ban, right, so that's done, right, and now we look at 7066 right now, and again, things are in fluid. To the best of our understanding is that 860,000 people are currently eligible to vote, and 500,000+ people have some sort of financial obligation. Now, in what we're doing, and we're operating under the law. So let me give an example. So in Miami-Dade, the district in Miami-Dade, the local court, state attorney, public defender worked with us, and we have the tools that were put specifically in the legislation to allow for the modification of sentences for people who have financial hardships. There's about 158,000 returning citizens in that district. About 75,000 of those folks are probably eligible under these programs to get their financial obligations modified. And so we have to allow for us to work underneath the law with the tools that are given in there to actually allow people who have financial obligations to work through these programs. We also have a fines and fees fund that we're using to actually pay directly for people's fines and fees. So we're like, man, we're just not stopping. You know what I'm saying? It's like it took us 7-8 years to get on the ballot. Like where we're going to be in 7 or 8 years, I don't know. But today we're going to get up and we're going to hustle because we love returning citizens, and that's family, and we're going to figure this out. So we appreciate the question and just kind of the spirit behind it.
Well, thank you. And so Neil, Tanisha, Senator Brandis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.